Please like and comment below and subscribe and share for more first-person encounters.
Case File A005-1. An Unintended Tale. I have a true story to share. This occurred in 1968 when I was 8 years old. My family lived in a large Italianate-style home in western Pennsylvania. It had been my father's home when he was a boy and had been in his family since the 1850s. At the time, my paternal grandparents were living there as well. In fact, my aunt and cousins also lived in separate apartments that had been built onto the original house. We were a very tight-knit family who were involved with a lot of the civic activities in our small community. My grandmother loved to read stories to me and my cousins, though most of the time it was only myself. She had a large sitting room on the second floor filled with 19th-century antiques. She preferred to read by candlelight as she did when she was a girl growing up in the same house. The atmosphere in the room was a throwback to a more simple time. This particular evening had an ominous feeling to it. It was early July and the house was exceptionally warm. There had been a series of thunderstorms with pouring rain off and on for several hours. I tried to get comfortable in the sitting room while listening to my grandmother read, but there was little relief. She had just read a short story from Grimm's fairy tales titled God's Food. This is from that story. There were once upon a time 2 sisters, one of whom had no children and was rich, and the other had 5 and was a widow, and so poor that she no longer had food enough to satisfy herself and her children. In her need, therefore, she went to her sister and said, "My children and I are suffering the greatest hunger. You are rich, give me a mouthful of bread." The very rich sister was as hard as a stone and said, "I myself have nothing in the house," and drove away the poor creature with harsh words. After some time, the husband of the rich sister came home and was just going to cut himself a piece of bread, but when he made the first cut into the loaf, out flowed red blood. When the woman saw that, she was terrified and told him what had occurred. He hurried away to help the widow and her children, but when he entered a room, he found her praying. She had her 2 youngest children in her arms, and the 3 eldest were lying dead. He offered her food, but she answered, "For earthly food have we no longer any desire. God has already satisfied the hunger of 3 of us, and He will hearken to our supplications likewise." Scarcely had she uttered these words than the 2 little ones drew their last breath, whereupon her heart broke, and she sank down dead. After she read the story, I told her that I was going to the kitchen to get a drink of cold water. She looked over at me and said, "Don't be long, you may miss something." I ran down the hallway to the kitchen and got my drink. I started to walk back towards the sitting room when I noticed a wispy white cloud rush out of the sitting room doorway and into my grandparents' bedroom across the hall. I was startled and immediately overcome with dread and apprehension. I walked slowly into the sitting room and knew right away that my grandmother had passed away. That same night, my grandfather, who had been feeling ill and was lying on his bed at the time my grandmother died, passed away in his sleep. A few years later, my 5th grade teacher gave each one of my classmates a list of literary collections, in which we were assigned to pick a few favorite short stories and give a report to the class. Grimm's fairy tales was part of the list, and I had no intentions on using any of the titles. The next day, my friend and classmate Linda came to my house after school. We were talking about the assignment and discussing which titles we would choose. As we read down the list, we came to Grimm's fairy tales. Immediately Linda said, "Nope, no Grimm's fairy tales." I asked her why. She explained that something weird happened to her when she was younger, and that Grimm's fairy tales brought back terrible memories. Wow. I asked what happened. Linda started to explain the scenario. It was a horrifying but familiar account. When Linda was very young, her father would read her and her sister bedtime stories. Every night their father would pick out a new short story. The girls looked forward to it since he would act out some of the characters. One night he decided to read God's Food, though he had warned them that it was just a fairy tale and that it conveyed a message about having goodwill towards others. He quickly read story, then kissed each of them goodnight. About a minute later they heard terrible thumping and crashing sounds. They jumped out of bed and ran out onto the landing to discover that their father had fallen down the stairs and had broken his neck. Their mother was hysterical and totally out of control to the point that she never recovered from their father's death. She eventually becoming a recluse. I was stunned by Linda's story. Since then I have wondered if this particular tale had caused other tragedies. I have researched for years but have never found anything similar to our experiences. Could these incidents be related somehow? I still live in the family home with my husband, and where we raised our 3 children. I would occasionally be visited by the spirits of my grandparents, and they were always together. In fact, they still pay me a visit around the Thanksgiving holiday, which they both truly enjoyed in life. Linda and I are still very close friends, but she misses her father deeply and wishes that he would find her one day. Jay-Z.
Case A005-2. Phantom Children. My son was in the basement playing on his box. He heard a noise in a close corner and looked over and saw a woman. He thought it may have been his mom and called over to see if she needed help. He received no response. He then got up and walked in the direction the woman headed to. He saw a woman that seemed to be pretty solid in appearance. He followed her only to see her vanish. It has now been some time and we have had a few new occurrences. My son and I were in out laundry room feeding the dogs. The dogs were outside at the time. My son said, "Dad, look." We observed a heavy leather coat move on a deer antler hook. There was no wind or either of us were close enough to make enough air motion to make that coat move. A few evenings ago we were watching television. My wife and granddaughter had gone to bed a few hours earlier. My son turned around and said there was a little girl almost the size of my granddaughter sitting in a chair right behind us. My son, thinking it was his daughter, asked what she was doing up. The girl said nothing and vanished. He said it was his daughter's size but had different appearance. I built this house about 3 years ago. There hadn't been a home on this site before. We live in the woods with only 2 other newer homes built around or just before ours was, and we were the builders. Some years ago there was an accident on a train track that borders our property on a corner. It's an old logging train that passes every once in a while. A couple was killed on the tracks when hit by a train. There was no little girl in that wreck. DB in Michigan.
Case A005-3. Phone calls from beyond. My wife had something weird happen to her this week. Last year her mother passed away. She had a long illness and had fallen, and the combination of the two proved too much, so she passed away a few days after her fall. My wife went back up a couple of weeks after the funeral to help her father with her mother's affairs, and on a Sunday night, while my wife was staying there, he passed away in his sleep. The family had not yet gotten over my mother-in-law passing when stricken with grief again. This all happened last fall, right before Thanksgiving. This past week my wife was at work in a meeting and got not 1, but 2 phone calls from her father's cell phone number. She showed me the call log on her iPhone, 2 calls from Dad. When he had passed away, the phone company was notified and they canceled the number. When my wife got out of the meeting, she called her father's old number. It was now a company number on a BlackBerry a woman had recently been given to use as her work phone. She was stunned when she heard the story. "Hi, you don't know me, but this used to be my deceased father's phone number, and I got 2 calls from this number today. And it, of course, wasn't the lady calling my wife, she doesn't know her number." And about the same time of these 2 calls, a relative calls, almost immediately after, just to say hello. That was weird too of her to call right after the 2 phantom calls. My wife's father was always having fun and had an engineering degree and was an Air Force officer. One relative said they could just see it now, up in heaven, my wife's father telling her mother he figured out a way to call their daughter. By the way, we'd often get calls from him because he would sit on his phone and hit the button and not realize he called us. May he sat on his phone in heaven. Bill.
This is Lon Strickler. If you like this program, it would help us if you would give it a thumbs up. Then subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notification when we upload new first-person encounters. We have many more to come very soon. And by the way, if you have a suggestion or an experience of your own, please leave a comment.